Welcome to Get Serious, where at Serious Land Capital, we have successfully funded over $6.5 million of land deals with industry-leading 41% operating margins. I also personally implement AI workflows to companies that are collectively doing over $50 million in annualized revenue. So as far as our topic for today concerns the intersection between real estate and AI, I really want to dive into further fact checking here and how that's influenced my thinking as it relates to the real estate market and why I think we might be in this frozen down cycle for even longer than I thought about even a month ago. So let's dive in here and to really direct today's process. And I kind of went over this, type of topic within the last month or so when it comes to, checking claims and the, nullius in verba. Don't take anybody's word for it in relation to parsing out real estate data. So similar here, but I think this is again like one of the most valuable topics possible because we are in a society now where it's never been easier to be misled with seemingly factual information and easy to consume, and more people than ever are not wanting to do the fact checking work and just accepting what's told to them. So I think this is a constant muscle that we all need to exercise here. So you've heard a number of times on this channel referencing the Reventure .app data, which again, I think Nick and his team, the way they're able to pull in, so much publicly available data, but also run their own analysis on some of the numbers for some just very easy to visualize graphs and data as it relates to super granular parts of the country when it comes to single family home investment data, as well as rentals too, and how that can kind of correlate to land. I mean, you've heard me mention this a number of times. And nothing but respect for Nick and his team here. And I'll routinely check in on his YouTube videos. I mean, a bigger following there. And I want to note that and I think I've mentioned this many times before, I have this Claude skill that I term the learning accelerator, and it effectively maintains my business and personal context. We'll take all the various timestamps as well as the transcript or book that I might throw into it, article, what have you, and then summarize accordingly based on how relevant it is to my own personal professional goals, and has a claim checking backstop. So anytime there's a certain claim made by whoever's presenting the information, Claude has permission to web search and figure out, okay, is this actually corroborated, or is it in conflict with other available data that again might support or kind of provide a counterpoint to whatever the presenter's opinion is or stated fact. And I even run this on myself, like I think it might have mentioned before, but a number of the times on these podcasts when I'm just riffing, I do try to prep as much as possible, but like no human being can hold all of the world's information in their head at any given time here. So like inevitably there's going to be unintended slip ups, or just might not have the right information. Or again, like sometimes, even within a day of publishing something, more relevant info comes to light, either publicly or, just from my own consumption of other information that could change some things. And so like whenever I utilize the transcript for these podcasts to help build out my weekly newsletter, like there's almost always corrections in place that has to be kind of backfilled and corrected for the newsletter by just running this claim check system. So like I just mentioned that because I'm not infallible about this. No one is, and I run this claim check and learning accelerator process on some of the absolute highest level experts in any particular field, like some of the biggest podcasts and so forth out there. So that's just to say, like, everybody is going to be fact checked at some point, and also being able to point out to like people's marketing incentives, what relationships or commercial interests they might have that might influence some of the claims they might be making, even if they're presenting it, as facts here, they might be, unconsciously influenced by some of those incentives. So like that is just something we constantly have to keep in mind. I know I've reiterated that from, one of my prior, um, podcasts and newsletters on the vein of this topic here, and really wanted to show a particular example within a recent Reventure video. This was from July 27th, 2026, about the Wall Street Journal, predicting more of a housing crash. It's like a 15-minute video. You can check that out. And again, just to mention this, too, like not, some of these videos that I've run through with Reventure, there will be more corroborated claim checks. This one just had more info that was like, hey, this doesn't seem quite right here. So I just want to run through this exercise so you can see, like, even somebody I really, really respect within the field, and I think does an excellent job when it comes to assessing and, collecting data within real estate. It just goes to show, like, the amount of data available is just so complex and, ever changing, that no matter how well read or confident somebody is about proclaiming something, it might not always be the case. And so I just wanted to provide some counterpoints, as well as, again, how that's kind of updated my thinking along the way here. So like, and I'll just run through, in brief, his kind of key points of the video, and then where some of those claim checks run in, and to end and summarize what I'm kind of thinking about going forward as it relates to our business and, my own direction. I'll probably take a separate podcast to run through like all those updated thoughts here, but, I can at least directionally give you some idea, so we can make sure we keep it relatively tight around that 20-minute range for these podcasts. So, Nick had, again, Nick's runs Reventure, and he had noted, again, Wall Street Journal saying in June that pending home sales had fallen. Biggest monthly drop in contract signings of this year. Second worst June performance on record. Mortgage purchase applications for the first 2 weeks of July, which he claims were tanking, down 42% versus the same week in 2019, and just 49% versus 2021, near all time lows. And he frames mortgage applications, it's a leading indicator for the next few months. And leading indicators, more future oriented in terms of predictive values, versus lagging indicators that are helpful as far as assessing what has actually happened historically, but might not be as correlated to what's actually going to happen for whatever you're measuring. And then he's just saying, the buying freeze, like, hey, if the economy were strong, like look at the stock market, et cetera, like why aren't people buying more houses? Like, it's a good question, it's good framing. And noting demand's been low for years, that people are actually realizing losses on the seller side now. And then he goes into a case study about a 500K new build in the Atlanta area that sold for 500K 5 years ago, 2021, housing boom. Post-COVID, now it's only listed at 375K. So, on paper, over a 6K loss. And this one, is a lower to middle income area, still, a $500,000 house. Possible investor buyers during the pandemic, but yeah, just noting, hey, there's some, more recent purchases that are running into seeming distress here. And then he's making the argument that post-crash pricing is showing up on individual listings because both demand is down and existing owners are hitting difficulty. So, certain buyers post-COVID, or, during that COVID rush, are running out of cash. They're unable to carry payments, perhaps forced job relocations, outright defaults. He was noting that the Mortgage Bankers Association is saying that delinquencies rose in Q1 of 2026 to 4.4% of all mortgages. It says that's the highest in 7 to 8 years, above pandemic era levels. Still says, it's nowhere near, the GFC 08-09, which was like closer to 12-ish%, but also mentioning, it can still be problematic if you're seeing rises in delinquencies anyway. So that's a note there, and that's certainly a claim check that will come back here, but I'll proceed on with what he was noting. So he was saying, losses first starting appearing in the lower income zip codes, but high income Atlanta areas, prices still up year over year. And, the K-shaped economy that we've noted prior, where the upper decile of the economy, have more equities exposure, stock market still being record highs. But, Nick points out there's a 130-year price to earnings chart that shows what appears to be a record bubble comparing only to the dot-com crash. So, noting, okay, there could be a possible stock market crash here that could, disintegrate or at least reduce demand and resilience from the upper portion of the economy here. And moving on from there, he noted another case study with a property in a nicer neighborhood that was listed at 700K in just 2 years ago. Now it's cut to 550K, and this was bought new in February 2020 for 480K. So this is a key point here, is because at 550K now, that's roughly 15% of nominal appreciation over 6+ years, which when you break that down is only about 2% annually against cumulative inflation of near 30% over that period of time. So like that's a key number to keep in mind here, is like against inflation. So even if some of these homes have appreciated, it's like a net loss in relation to inflation. And then he's going into, why he's saying this is housing depression, and saying, pending sales index is at 72.5 as of June against, when this index started in 2001 with a baseline of 100. So he's noting that contract signings are 28% below their level 25 years ago, roughly 40% below the pandemic peak, and 30% pre-pandemic norm, and noting that sales and contract signings as a percentage of all homeowners is now worse than 08-09 on a relative basis, and the longest stretch of sub 4.5% turnover in US history. And so he's saying, the duration, not the price, is what's justifying the word depression. So that's another note there. Again, we'll claim check that in a bit. And as he starts to reach the conclusion in his video, he's saying, hey, the counter argument, Steel Manning's argument is that, national prices are near record, but he's saying that, the explanation is that the sellers either don't know or they don't care about the demand conditions. They're not as in the know about real estate. So they overprice, but that's not necessarily leading to closes that are justifying that price that they're actually trying to achieve. And he's saying, that is dislocation, not resilience of the market, and it eventually resolves through price cuts here. And in relation to that dislocation, he's just saying that remote work share is negatively correlated with home price. So he did a whole bunch of review on his Reventure app and sorted out info that had counties and areas that were heavier on remote work, that it was correlated with home values decreasing year over year versus return to office areas of the country. They tended to have more appreciation for homes in the area here. So again, there's a claim check that will come up for this, and then he's saying that remote work created this, quote unquote, dispersionary force. So like people in downtown areas could move further out from the city or, state to state. But now it's a reverse force, which he terms agglomeration, which is like pulling demand back to the center cities. And so that's why we see in the last 3 to 6 months, price cuts have broadened from the lower to middle income areas and investor markets into higher income neighborhoods as well, that were on more of the dispersionary areas of the country that had absorbed all of that remote work. And he's just noting, that this downturn or lack of appreciation on home prices has just continued to expand. I know we've talked about this. Initially it was like a Florida, Texas story. Now, we're seeing that in Georgia, Tennessee, other parts of the country. And then he goes ahead and pitches Reventure and also notes, hey, utilize this to negotiate more with home sellers so you can get a better deal. So like, he's potentially more incentivized for people to use his tools so that they could get concerned that, hey, there's a real housing depression, so hey, I should negotiate harder in order to get better pricing on deals that might be available. I know it kind of repeated itself, but relevant to note the incentive structure in place, because again, that is just always critical for whoever we are listening to, including myself. Just always keep that in mind here. So now with the actual claim checks, you get, the positioning here. Now let's actually dive into, when I ran it through this quad skill and, pulling all of the various information that's publicly available here. So, we had noted, and this is not always in the exact order as I had noted it. So we might be jumping around a bit here. But, when I had mentioned, the June pending home sales posting their biggest monthly drop of 2026 and second worst in history. This was closer to the start. And then also the index was at 72.5. So, much, 28% drop compared to the relative 2001 levels. So, the NAR's release confirms that this pending sales did indeed fall 5.4 month over month, but that index is down only 0.3% year over year. So, and this was only the first decline in 5 months. So saying the phrase biggest drop of 2026 is true, but it was the only meaningful drop in 2026. And, a separate piece of data from Housing Wire actually showed pending single family sales up 4.1% year over year as of July 10th. And the NAR report attributed that June softness to the highest mortgage rates in nearly a year. Actually, I think they've peaked even higher as of early August, late July here. So that kind of collided with that record median price. And so if we look at this like on a year over year level, it's really showing that the market is flat and more rate sensitive, but not necessarily like falling precipitously. If we look at 5.4% drop month over month, but year over year. And I showed data like this too in my other report about a month ago, where we have to separate out relative rates and where you're actually taking snapshots of data. And so, if it's been flat over roughly a year, it just tells a bit of a different story. So, flat, but still, it's not a great market. Flat at an already depressed level of activity, still a hard market to dispo. So, but it's not necessarily decreasing in, or increasing distress rather. And then he noted that mortgage purchase applications are tanking in the first 2 weeks of July, near all-time lows. However, what's contradicted in regard to that is that the MBA, which is the Mortgage Association, their own weekly survey showed that seasonally adjusted purchase index rose 6% in the week ending July 17th and sat about 0.2% above the same week a year earlier. And then the prior week, which was ending in July 10th, did fall 7%, but MBA explicitly attributed that to the July 4th holiday adjustment. And one of the industry experts, Joel Kahn, noted that purchase applications had been ahead of 2025's pace with year over year growth for roughly 3 months. And another industry expert within the MBA tied that modest strength to growing inventory supporting purchase activity, even with the 30-year conforming rate at about 6.7. So this undercuts the demand is collapsing leg here, considering there was almost like a complete flip in relation to week over week data here compared to just looking at the first 2 weeks of July. And it seems that, Nick with Reventure might have, perhaps inadvertently cherry picked a piece of data or a certain week that made the demand look even worse than was actually true, because it was so influenced by a holiday. And then he had noted that, again, the MBA data had showed delinquencies rising to 4.4% in the Q1 of this year, highest in 7 to 8 years. So this piece is true, seasonally adjusted, up 18 basis points quarter over quarter, 40% or 40 basis points, not 40%, 40 basis points year over year. And foreclosure starts up 4 basis points to 0.24%. However, you have to really look at the composition of this data. So conventional delinquencies actually fell 14 basis points to 2.75%, whereas the FHA and VA loans rose significantly. FHA up to 11 point, VA loans up to 4.99%. So that's what really drove that increase in delinquencies versus conventional loans here. And a lot of this was affected by the expiration of pandemic era FHA relief that stopped in September of last year, 2025, and trial payment plan accounting that kept FHA loans classified as delinquent until a permanent workout lands. So the FHA foreclosure inventory, hit its highest level since 2018, VA since 2017, because of some of the relief packages that have disappeared. But we should also note that most of those FHA and VA loans are, if they are going to be distressed, like that inventory typically will be more entry level to low down payment, like an exurban product rather than across the board here. So like these are on average going to be lower value properties anyway, that could be in more distress. Another claim here. So when he was saying that sales volume relative to the housing stock is worse than the GFC 0809, longest such stretch in US history with roughly 4.5% turnover. So Redfin had noted that about, or just a little less than 3% of all US homes changed hands in the first 3 quarters of 2025. That was actually the lowest rate in 3 decades versus 3.4% in 2012 and 4.4% at the pandemic peak in 2021. And Redfin can only go back to like the early to mid 1990s. So we're like, 30-ish years back. So, when Nick at Reventure is mentioning, in US history, potentially longest stretch, like it's a bit of a stretch because the data doesn't go back that far anyway. And then, the claim check is also noting like that 4.5% figure that he's utilizing is using a different denominator than Redfin's. So, we always have to check, okay, how are the calculations actually being produced? And Redfin, again, really points for this lower turnover to be, attributed to the lock-in effect. We've talked about endlessly here. A lot of people are familiar with it. More than 70% of mortgage owners right now are holding sub 5% rates against a current market rate above 6%. So, they're just not incentivized to list here. And so like this is still showing like it's still more of a frozen market where existing home sales ran at, about 4 million annualized, inventory at about 4.6 months, like technically not a buyer's market for existing inventory. And so, frozen markets, it's fewer transactions because the prices are so stubborn, which affects dispo velocity, but you won't really get an acquisition discount either. So we can't really read that low turnover as an incoming buying opportunity as well. And the final claim check for this is that, when he was mentioning the stock market at, the price earnings ratio being at an all-time high or, just under where the .com bubble was, is that, right now the the Schiller CAPE score is like, just over 40 as of June and July of this year. The long time mean is near 17 and a half. And pre.com, it was all-time high of 44.2. And he said, sustained readings above 40 have only occurred in the .com bubble. But a key caveat here that the claim check noted is that the CAPE score, the CAPE, has a well-documented near zero predictive power at 12-month horizons for stock performance. But, functions as a long run expected return signal, but not a timing tool. So yeah, you'd still have to read that there's risk within the system, but are you able to time anything and be able to tell, hey, we're like imminently potentially going to be facing crash of the stock market? That it's not something that we'll be able to tell this, and we have 130 years of data to move with. So those were all the claim checks here, which again, you can really see it would be really hard to hold all of that data in hand and just be able to like speak off the cuff for such complex topics like this. And that, where, Nick's presentation of, hey, this is like effectively a housing depression here, when we actually look through the data more thoroughly, like it seems that the market, is just just more of a frozen setup here. And I have some other research that corroborates this as well. And so like our positioning internally of like holding liquidity for the distressed assets, while still sound in the underlying principle, the timing of it might be far more difficult to ascertain or prepare for. And like these current market conditions that we're sitting on, they could last for potentially years now. Like we've already been in this for like 4 years straight. Our new read is that, hey, this could easily be another half decade or more. And like, how should we position liquidity in relation to that? How do we strategize our business? So again, that's a whole nother discussion here, but that's kind of like the landing point on our new framing that we have to consider versus like, hey, the stress is potentially nearer, and liquidity would have greater near term value. Especially, and again, like, okay, some of the distressed opportunities could be these FHA foreclosure starts, and potentially like overbuilt inventory in the Sunbelt submarkets. Like, okay, but are those really assets that you really want to go into anyway? Unless again, it's like super dirt cheap prices, but it's not like national turnover that was happening closer to the GFC here. So that's something we have to keep in mind here, is that like this market is just not handing us discounts, but it is handing us slow exits. So again, just very tricky to operate within. So, and again, like it was pointing out as I was reading over my notes again here too, that again, you just always have to manage the manage the incentives that who is presenting the data is how they're presenting things. And so it's like, yeah, Nick at Reventure, he's selling a monthly subscription for a product whose value proposition is the depression framing, and that's why uncharitably perhaps he picked the holiday distorted mortgage application week, omitted that conventional delinquencies actually fell, and read a supply side freeze as a demand side collapse, which we found the information and data that pointed counter to what he was framing there. That being said, like all these other items are relevant here, and some of those other case studies that he mentioned could have been cherry picked a bit more when we're looking at the overall data. And some of these other Reventure videos that I've run through this are like much more largely corroborated with less pushback on the claims here. So keep in mind my own cherry picking, but I really wanted to utilize this as, again, another lesson in framing and how much we need to double check anything, including what we say, to ensure that we're utilizing the most accurate data possible, and just being willing to turn on a dime depending on what the truth actually displays to you, and not just hold on to potentially false beliefs because it's more convenient for whatever mental framing you've already developed. So we are sitting tight in the midst of, again, this frozen market and trying to pivot and act accordingly here. We're still deploying a lot of capital this year. I have hundreds of thousands of dollars personally out on deals, and expecting to do more here shortly. So it's not preventing us from acting. It's just making us even more cautious than before. So subscribe and share, everybody. Hopefully this one was interesting to you. I absolutely love these topics. Let me know in the comments, or message me directly if you want to see more like this, or the opposite. Of course, feedback's always appreciated. Again, if you want any funding for your deals, SeriousLand.capital, you can submit there. Or if you're interested in working with me directly for AI implementation into your business with the most cutting edge workflows in the world. Again, I work for companies that are collectively earning over $50 million annualized revenue, and looking for a select handful of boutique clients to implement AI workflows into their business. So you can reach out to me about that directly as well. Take care, everybody. Talk to you next time. Bye.